Welcome, everybody. I'm Kathleen Trapphagen, co-facilitating the GFE OST Impact Group with Rebecca Goldberg. And first of all, I want to congratulate you for re-registering for this series. We asked people to opt in. We've been collecting registration since the beginning of 2020. So we want to make sure that this is actually something that you still want to do. And so thank you, all of you, for crossing that hurdle, and congratulations. We're super excited to see you today. We have a terrific panel, so I'm not going to take up any more time other than to say that the conversation that we're having today is the second in a three-part series of conversations that we're having about out-of-school time youth development workforce. In not last month, but the month before, we did a panel on emergency solutions and challenges facing the workforce. And today we're going to be talking about supporting leaders of color. And next month, we're going to be talking about long-term structural policy and practice agenda changes. So thanks for being with us. If you could introduce yourself in the chat. So let's do your name, your pronouns, your organization, where you are geographically, and something that is making you happy today. So throw that in, and I am going to turn it over to Ruth Jorgensen. She is our moderator for today. Thank you, Ruth, for being here. She is the founder of Corazon Partners and also with Thrive Paradigm, has a lot of experience in this issue around supporting leaders of color, so brings her own experience and expertise and also terrific skills as a moderator. So I am turning it to you. Thank you, Ruth.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. It's great to share this space with all of you here for the next hour. Like Kathleen said, my name is Ruth Jorgensen with Corazon Catalyst and have also been doing work nationally with Thrive Paradigm since I departed the California School Age Consortium, which is one of the deeper examples and experiences I bring to this space as it relates to supporting leaders of color, emerging leaders of color. So just honored to be here and to hold space for the panelists. Know quite a bit about NAA and their program, and I'm learning a lot about Pinkerton and the program that they're leading. It's just really great work that we look forward to sharing with you all. So in opening the panel here today, I was asked to bring in a bit about my experience, but more so the takeaways and the landscape that I've experienced and can offer into the space as well. And so, like I said, prior to becoming a consultant for the last 2 years, I was with the California School Age Consortium, CalSAC, and about 10 years ago, we developed a fellowship for leaders of color. And we entered into that with the intention to raise the dialogue around the inequities in leadership. And there's plenty of data around the racial leadership gap. Race to Lead is a great resource. And although we don't have the strongest data in our field around our workforce, although there are really great surveys that even NAA has done, we don't have a strong comprehensive snapshot. That being said, we know that in nonprofit, in the social sector, we have a challenge with the gap in leadership as well. And so we know that there's work to do. And anecdotally, the tables I sat at as an executive director at policy levels, national tables, typically 80% of the leaders around those tables were white, even in California, right? So we know that there's work to be done and don't necessarily need more data to tell us that, especially people of color don't need more data to tell them that there's a gap and a need. So we entered into that and very much leaning into the capacity building side of things and bench building side with the fellowship. And many other foundations and organizations were also putting energy the last 10 plus years into building the skills and capacity. And what's really coming to the forefront, and some of the recent reports, including from Race to Lead, are saying we didn't really move the needle much in terms of diversifying leadership. So that's not the only solution, right? We're missing something. And something I share in the equity work that I do now is, if our leadership is not reflective of the children you've served and our staff that are at the direct service level, we are doing a disservice to Black and brown kids, to low-income children, if they're not sitting in leadership now, right? Because leaders of color are there now, they're just not in the positions. So there's much work. We are part of the problem, if that's still the reality after the type of investments that have been made. So the CalSAC Leadership Development Institute was integral to also the development of a few other programs serving out-of-school time professionals, including NAAs, which we're going to hear about today, as well as Tipping Point, which is a foundation based in the Bay Area that modeled their fellowship after the program. And currently, I'm doing quite a bit of work still supporting leaders of color, including leaders of color that are now executives. And so we're going to hear from Pinkerton, who is supporting executives of color. And so it's a really great opportunity to hear about the emerging and folks in, and what does it look like to support leaders of color at all levels. Couple other things to just share in the framing in terms of some takeaways here, and that we can listen for from the panelists and even think about in terms of how we address this work. One is we have to go beyond capacity building, beyond a pipeline. Folks are there. So what does it look like to change the face and the practice of leadership now, right? The other is around social capital. We didn't think much about that at CalSAC, but that's very much emerging as one of the biggest barriers to leaders of color advancing into the positions and sustaining themselves and being able to remain within the positions. And there's some new reports that have come out about the challenge with leaders of color moving into executive positions, replacing white leadership in positions and not having the social capital and support. So that's the access to the people who currently hold power. And the people who currently hold power is the money, which are foundations, boards, executives, which are all largely white. So opening up those relationships is actually a critical part of the executive fellowship that I'm leading and designing with the other foundation I'm working with. Another is around practice and culture shifts, right? We can't only invest in leaders of color and not address the systems that we end up working in, and looking at policies, practices, and culture. And that gets at retention, right? Just checking a diversity box, like the culture and climate around us has said no more, right? We need to go deeper and look at holistically how are our organizations going beyond diversity, looking at systems change, really honing into what equity-centered, counter-dominant, anti-racist business practices look like to help all leaders thrive and leaders of color. The last couple I'll highlight is around designing by and for leaders of color. So the folks directly impacted by issues needing to be at the table in the design process in determining what are the solutions. And that's actually one of the key pieces around policy practice shift and culture shift is power sharing and decision making, ensuring that we shift measures of success, that they go beyond certain measures that we hold right now in order to create space for leaders of color and to shift our practices across the organization. I think the last thing I would highlight in terms of takeaways that also emerged out of the work I've been doing before and the work I'm doing now, which is with various out-of-school time networks, as well as direct service providers. And that is work that white leaders have to do, and identifying and looking at what is that work, right? And knowing that it's holistic. So that's what I have to offer to launch us off here in terms of what some of this work has looked like, what some of the takeaways are. And so now we want to hone in and dig into two models that will really bring to life what it looks like to do some of this work and make some progress and movement. So we want to start off with having our panelists introduce themselves here. So if we can start off with Danielle, just sharing name, organization, pronouns, and a sentence or two about why you're joining this panel.
Thank you, Ruth. Hi, I'm Danielle Pulliam. I'm a program officer at the Pinkerton Foundation. We support programs in New York City in the 5 boroughs. We fund youth programs with the goal of giving young people access to opportunities they would not otherwise have. And my role is, as a program officer, I support a portfolio of programs as well as our racial equity work supporting leaders of color. So I'll leave it at that. And I'm so excited to be part of this conversation.
Thanks, Danielle.
I'm Erika Hamilton, founder of a bespoke executive coaching and consulting firm called the Memo I Never Got. I have the pleasure of working with Danielle and the Pinkerton Foundation on the newly launched program for our BIPOC grantee leaders. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about that a little bit more.
Thanks, Erika.
Hi, I'm Erika Halstead. That's definitely going to get confusing, so sorry about that. I am the executive director of Minds Matter New York City, which is a college access and success organization. My pronouns are she, her, or ella. And I am part of the Pinkerton Foundation's Advanced Leadership Network for executives of color, and I'm excited to share my experiences with you today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gina Wagner, pronouns she, her. I'm the president and CEO of the National Afterschool Association. I'm here to talk about how within our association we have focused on emerging leaders of color, and I'm joined by one of my staff members and our board chair as well.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tommy Brewer. I am the board chair for the National Afterschool Association. In my day job, I'm the deputy chief of innovations and partnerships for Think Together. Think Together is a statewide education nonprofit in California. We're the largest provider of expanded learning programs in California that are funded by state and federal grants. I'm interested in this conversation both from an NAA perspective, but also from a practitioner perspective. I'm an executive at a very large system that has the opportunity to continue to expand how we are centering our leaders of color into positions that matter.
Thanks, Tommy.
Hello, my name is Angelic Bertillo, and I'm the Director of Advocacy and Workforce Initiatives for National Afterschool Association. And the perspective I'm bringing in is as a next generation leader of after school, and as how we're going to develop next gens going forward. Looking forward to the conversation.
That's great. Thank you all. All right, let's dig in, and we're going to start off with learning about the Advanced Leadership Network, which is supported by Pinkerton Foundation based out of New York City. And so let's start off with Danielle. Danielle, start us off by sharing why the foundation is embarking upon this initiative and what you hope to achieve.
Thanks, Ruth. So the foundation, like so many foundations, we're on a journey right now to advance racial equity. And I think, you know, we care about the work that our organizations are doing. And I think in the spring of 2020, the simultaneous calamities of the global health pandemic and racial injustice and political strife, that put that on the forefront. So we were in conversations as a staff, including the board as well, wanting to take action, wanting to do something that was timely but not hasty. So we began a lot of internal and external conversations with each other and with the grantees and the leadership that we support. So there was a strong desire to act in a thoughtful way. And in our conversations with leaders, we saw that there was a void in terms of support for leaders. There was a lot of capacity in terms of pipeline, and that's so needed, but the existing leaders felt like there wasn't that support there. And as the research has shown, they are underfunded historically, leaders of color. So we wanted to create a space together to do that. And so in those conversations, we decided we wanted to do something. We have some funds that we've done for grants, but we wanted to do something with the leaders and figure out, where we have a history of networks, creating different networks on areas that we care about. So that's how we started with that. And that's where DEIB expert Erika Hamilton enters the picture. And so I'm going to just pass it over to her so she can kind of really talk about the design and structure and all of the expertise that she brought into making the project happen.
That's great. I am really looking forward to hearing about this, being in the same world doing this type of work, Erika. So if you can also share, when you share about the design, any of the challenges you're also facing and what you're hoping to achieve as well.
Yep. So I will keep it brief and maximize our time. But yeah, one of the most important aspects of this initiative when we were initially building it was to make sure that we weren't mandating or dictating what the shape of the space had to be before we actually could understand what the leaders needed it to be. And so that is a little antithetical to how you see programs typically designed, where the full service offering is sort of architected, it's marketed, and a leader steps into that. What the Pinkerton Foundation very courageously decided to do was to essentially invest in holding a space to decide what type of leaders they wanted to focus on, which are BIPOC leaders at the executive level, because the thought was to really think about where do we think leadership becomes, unfortunately, sometimes really isolating and even lonely at moments. And how do you try to think about putting more programming and resourcing out based on what those leaders are actually articulating that they need for their work, but also, quite frankly, to have sustainability as human beings doing the work for long periods of time. And so part of what we did in the design was to really think about how do we put in resources that we knew were very in demand, but very scarce. So things like executive coaching is something that we know organizations typically can't dedicate their resources towards because it's not sort of in the direct services bucket, but it's really critical to their success and their organization's success. Really thinking about how can we put in time and opportunity to build those leaders' social capital through networking and exposing them to people they may not otherwise have a chance to build relationship and rapport with and learn from. And then really spending a lot of our upfront time when we started convening the cohort, really trying to hear from them on the ground real time, especially in the moment that we launched this program. You know, what is it that you think you need most, again, to advance the work of your organization, but also to build up and strengthen your leadership.
Great. Thanks, Erika. And if folks have any questions that are emerging, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll try to work them in as well. I appreciate that. I definitely have questions myself for you. We're going to hear from Erika, or other Erika, first. So Erika, tell us about your journey of becoming a leader of color in the field and why you decided to become a part of the Advanced Leadership Network.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. You know, my leadership journey to get to the place where I am has really been focused on communities of color. So my family immigrated from Colombia before I was born. I was born here in the United States. And from the beginning, it was very clear to me that there were people in my family who had and people in my family who had not. And my parents are both first generation college students. It was very clear to me. My father, by the way, is one of 10, the only one to go to college. So it was very, very clear to me the role that education played. And so my focus from the beginning of my career has been on communities of color. I will say, as a leader, you know, a friend of mine jokes that they can't pay him enough to be Black. I feel that way. They cannot pay me enough to be Latina. They love to, you know, in my career, people have loved to point that out, have loved to say, look at our diversity, here she is. And that's been a major part of my career, right? And I hope we get to talk about this later, but it's also had a lot of implications for the roles that I've been able to play in the kinds of places where I've been welcome and not welcome. But I've been in this role for almost 7 years. I think, you know, when I thought about joining the PALN, the Pinkerton Advanced Leaders Network, I really was focused on many of the things that Erika Hamilton said. One of the things that I felt very strongly was that it is a very lonely job. It's very isolating being here in this spot, especially if you don't have a diverse board. That's been an ongoing struggle. I think the other thing that was really important to me was this idea, and Ruth, you brought this up before, of social capital, right? It was very clear to me that certain doors, again, were open around mentorship, around sponsorship, around invitations to be part of organizations and works and conversations. And certain doors were closed, right? So all of the white CEOs I know are part of leadership groups of other white leaders leading organizations. And I mean, I hope it's not just me, but I was never invited to be like that. I never knew anybody who was a person of color who was in a group like this. And so that was a really big draw for me. And I think the last thing, Erika Hamilton brought this up, but was the opportunity to get coached. And in this space, as an executive, there are not a lot of opportunities to be coached by other BIPOC coaches and leaders. And the things that we face are doubly challenging, especially when you are a leader of color in this particular time and place, right? The weight that we have carried over the last 2 years, not just with COVID and seeing our own communities affected disproportionately, but also with the expectations that leaders have had around confronting racial injustice have been, I think, 5 times as much as what I've seen white leaders tackle. And so I was really excited about having an opportunity to get coached by somebody who had had at least some of those same experiences. And when I said, hey, this felt a little off, or this felt like it had some racial undertones, they didn't come back to me and say, no, I disagree, right? They were right there with me. So I hope we get to the chance to talk about all of these, but that's my experience in a nutshell.
Thanks, Erika, and thanks for sharing your story with us openly, and appreciate that. So we have a little bit of time still before we need to go on to our next program. So I'm going to ask a probing question. I don't see it in the chat right now. So one of the things in my decade or so of holding space for these fellowships that I would hear year after year is this is a sacred space that is formed, that even with the CEOs and execs that we're holding this current fellowship with and this work that I'm doing, folks are saying, I've never had a space like this. And some of them have been in it for 10 years, some have been in it for 2 years, right? And so I'm curious if one or more of you can speak to what about the design do you think contributes to creating a sacred space, and what that even means to you?
I might jump in before Erika. She really talked, I know Danielle and Erika both entered this so intentionally, right? That this is a space designed for us, by us. And I think when we think about a sacred space, it does feel safe for us to share both the high and the low, right? The things that are not just, they're not just about being a person of color, right? In some spaces, there is a lot of like forced conversation around that, right? That obviously comes up, but we're also able to talk about HR issues. We're also able to talk about fundraising. We're also able to talk about all of the other things that affect us as leaders. And I think the opportunity to share the design of this space has been really special in making it protected and a real community.
Great, thank you.
The only thing I would add, and thank you, Erika Halstead, is we started this program with that intention, and that intention carries throughout real time in the program's existence. So it does require a bit of patience, I will say, because things shift and evolve constantly. So everything, even things like, we end every session with a very, very quick written, like, respond to these 5-question survey. And part of what we're seeking is feedback on what works for you in these sessions, what does not work. And we then use that to basically redesign before we do a next session. And our sessions are typically about a month apart. So we're trying to also encourage the leaders to understand we're not purporting a magical lamp sort of approach in our space. Like, we can't make all your dreams come true, But we do want the leaders to realize that this space is for you, and it is built on your feedback, your candid response, which again, that is atypical of the grantee grant maker relationship. So kudos to the Pinkerton Foundation for doing this, and also just applause to the leaders for trusting that is what we're doing and for leaning into it so deeply, because it is really creating for a very magical sort of unique experience for everyone involved right now.
That's great. Thanks, Erika.
And
yeah,
I just want to add one thing. I think also, I think we went into it, as Erika Hamilton said, we went into it, the foundation, really trying to, it's a co-creation model, but we selected the individuals because of the organizations that they are leading. And those are organizations that we care deeply about. But we've definitely evolved to, we care about the leaders first and foremost. So it's about them, regardless of what seat they're in, because they have a passion for young people. And we have had some leaders transition to other organizations, but we are connected to the leader. And I think that kind of, it's beyond the professional, it's personal as well. So I just wanted to make sure I mention that, because I think these leaders need that space for personal support as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for that, Danielle. I'm going to fit in one more question here before we pivot to NAA and hear about their program, and we'll have some time to ask some more questions too if things come up for folks. I want to bring in one of the questions I see in the chat and kind of dovetail with one that I have here. So the implications for the foundation, and maybe I'm misinterpreting that. So if someone wants to add in their question, the implications for the foundation. So what does it mean for the foundation to be investing in this way? And what you all are naming around this co-creation model, which is what a foundation I'm working with took the same approach or similar approach. It probably looks different, right? But this co-creation really shifting along the way. And then they are also looking internally, and it's opening up conversations internally around their own leadership. So curious about implications for the foundation, if there's anything to share there around learnings for folks when you enter into doing work this way that maybe is more atypical.
I think that the biggest lesson is that to do things differently. Like we had strict board guidelines in terms of supporting direct service organization, and so this program is not a direct service youth program. So we're stepping outside of our tradition, and there is discomfort in that change, but if we say we care about racial equity, we have to be willing to do things differently. So I think that's the biggest question. How do you, as foundations, how do we do things differently? How do we challenge the guidelines? If we truly care about these issues, we have to do things differently to make an impact. So I'm so proud of the board. There's so much more that we can do. I think we're in the infancy stage, but I'm so proud that we are doing something. And that's what my challenge to all the foundations that are present is to do a little bit something. It's not going to necessarily, we're not necessarily getting everything right. There's a lot of kind of missteps, but in course corrections, but we have to be willing to do something and invest resources to do it. And so it's a combination.
Great. Thank you for that, Danielle. So I'm capturing questions in the chat here. I'm going to pivot to NAA so we can hear about the work that they're doing, and then we'll come back together. And so if you have other questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll try to see if I can bring them in towards the end as well. So let's hear about the next gen leaders and NAA's work, hearing about their initiatives. So I want to start off actually with Angelica. So you were chosen as a next gen leader a few years ago when you were at the Dallas Afterschool Network. So can you share with folks a bit about the program design and how you benefited from the program?
Yeah, definitely. So the Next Generation Leaders Award is we nominate, or people nominate, about 20 to 35 after school professionals that are really making a lasting impact in after school. Either they're starting out in their community, local level, state level, national, whatever it may be. and they've just been recognized for their work. And so we receive those applications and then we highlight them in our magazine and also at convention, our NAA convention. And then they're given opportunities throughout the year of, being on panels or being in podcasts or anything that may come up. Like, we really need someone to give input on the after school workforce. So that'll be sent out. So there's different opportunities for them to engage in and really network with one another and other after school leaders across the country. When I was nominated, it was 2018. And because of this question, I was thinking back to one of our first sessions with Gina. And two things really stood out to me and really helped me at Dallas After School and my transition to NAA. So one of the first sessions, we received a book, which I still have. And one of the pages, it's Together is Better, a little book of inspirations. And one of the lessons in there is leadership is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge. And when I read that and really thought about it, it changed the work that I did in every aspect of everything I was associated with. I was, had to take a step back and like, how am I taking care of everyone else that I want to bring along with me or that's in my space? So that changed so much for me and really impacted me. And then there was another session I had because Gina was our mentor, which is great because, I would have never had access to her had I not been honoree for NAA. It was in the beginning of the year and I don't remember exactly what we were talking about. She's like, what do you want to be? And I was just like, I had trouble answering that. I was like, I don't know what I want to be. I thought it was like job wise, right? I was like, oh, I think I want to do this. And she's like, no, like, do you want to be courageous? What do you want to do this year? And I remember just having so much trouble. But then when I was starting with NAA, I thought back to that. I was, what do I want to be in this new role? And the first thing was confident, because once I finally sat in the seat, had my email, I was like, oh, this is real. And I felt a little intimidated, but I was like, no, I got this job and I know what I'm doing. I know this field. So I have to be confident in myself. And the other was curious, because although I am an expert in after school, I'm now on a different level and I have to be open to learning so much more. So being confident and being curious, which I think away and have really helped me in the past 4 or 5 years, whenever 2018 was, which makes me so excited about what we're doing with our past next gen honorees and our future one for convention. And what we're doing right now is we're meeting with our next gens to see what they would want to maybe have exposure to at convention, but also we're planning a leadership panel. So that way they can hear from different leaders and after school at different levels about their career paths and things that they've learned along the way, because we know for a lot of these people it's about connections and knowledge. That's what they want. Especially in our racial equity report for after school leadership, one of our recommendations for supporting emerging leaders of color specifically is to ensure that leadership development is multidimensional. So sure, you get, how to plan a budget, maybe nonprofit accounting, whatever it may be, but also how do you think strategically and plan and think big for organizations, because we really want to inspire the next gens to stay in the field of after school and continue to grow in this space.
Yeah.
So we're doing a lot of planning around that.
That's great. That's great. And definitely seeing some through lines with bringing folks to the table at the design process, buy-in for. Great.
I like
Let's hear. So Gina, let's bring your voice in here. So we understand that you're using or utilizing this program as an anchor for opening up leadership opportunities within NAA, so somewhat of a pipeline even within the organization. So can you tell us more about that and how you think that might be transformative for NAA?
Yeah, I thought I could start by talking about kind of why we zeroed in on this particular part of our membership. So I think it's such a great complement to what Pinkerton is doing, that we're both looking at what these impactful intervention points are. So NAA, we have a membership of over 30,000. So it was really important if we were going to be impactful in our work, while a lot of work we do is for the broad field, when we decided as an association about 8 years ago that we were going to really go deep into leadership. We tried to decide where could we have the most impact, and we really focused in on what we call these next generation of after school leaders. And we kind of looked at 2 data points on that. The first was that we knew that the first 3 to 5 years of employment were crucial for our field. That was the inflection point where we really lost a lot of people that, they said, okay, I've done this and this is not going to be my career, I'm leaving. So we knew for maintaining a workforce that this was a crucial intervention point. And then the other piece is that we knew that when it came to the diversity of our field, that was where we had the most diversity, that the racial leadership gap only widened as people went up the career ladder. So if we could intervene at this important workforce time, at this point where we had a real diversity of leadership, we really believe that we could make an impact on our field. And I will say our next generation of after-school leaders are not exclusively leaders of color, but they are overwhelmingly leaders of color. So just wanted to set that up. And to Angelica's point, we began this evolution of what this looked like. And it started relatively simply because we were investing ourselves as an association, and it started with just simple recognition. How can we recognize that, these are leaders and that we value what they do? And I will tell you, Angelica mentioned, we generally have around 100, sometimes we've gotten as high as 150 nominees, and we generally select between 25 and 30 every year. I will say this, I continue to be astounded by what we ask 22-year-olds in our field to do. I'm just going to say that. When I look at what some of the responsibilities are for young people, it is just astounding. But anyway, a really impressive group. And then again, we select these nominees. And so now we're looking at, a cohort of almost 200 individuals that we have recognized. And the recognition has now grown to include some more directed educational opportunities. We've made a commitment from our association that we're using our communications platforms to highlight these voices, to give opportunities, to author articles, to be nationally published, by these leaders in our field. And then we are also looking at, and Tommy will talk about this, some specific leadership opportunities designed for them. And I also want to say, Ruth, before we get to that, we are also looking beyond capacity building, because we all know, and it bears repeating again, an individual can be the most determined individual, but if they're working in a system that doesn't support their development, and particularly if they're a leader of color, then we're not helping them to be successful. So NAA has also, and just the last week, released really what I think a very important systemic tool. It's an equitable hiring practices guide. How can we bring a more equitable focus to the job interview process, the job performance process, the job evaluation? Again, so we are really looking at sustaining employment, growing employment, building employment opportunities, and career advancement opportunities for leaders of color. Also have revised our core knowledge and competencies to bring an equitable focus to that, believing that practicing in an equitable way is an element of quality. And so what do our leaders, so those who are leaders of color moving up in the field, those who are employing leaders of color, how can we bring that equitable lens to the work that we're doing there?
Yeah,
but I think, as Danielle mentioned, and also as Erika Halstead, they both talked about boards. Danielle talked about her board and Erika Halstead talked about hers. There's only so much a staff can do without full support of the board. So I'll let you turn it over to Tommy.
That's great. Thanks, Gina. And thanks for drawing out the investment in the individual through this program, and then the systems. How do we support the organizations that they're in to do this work? So it's great to see how that continuum is emerging for you all in the work that you're doing. So yeah, let's hear from Tommy. So Tommy, share with us what the role of the NAA board is in this work, and how you think that NAA can best leverage its role as a national organization supporting leaders of color in the workforce. Yeah.
Again, I'm enjoying this whole conversation. the role of the NAA board is the role of any board, and it's to support and inform the intentions and the work of the association. So all of the things that both Gina and Angelica have been talking about, it's our role to provide the support to Gina and the staff at our association to deliver to this broad field of 30,000 members in our association. But then beyond that, I think it's also important for the board to be very introspective about how the association itself is practicing what it preaches, right? So when we talk about positioning young leaders of color in ways that they find meaningful in their experience, our board has done a lot of work. One, in looking at our board's representation, both in terms of race, both in terms of age, both in terms of region, and ensuring that our board represents this field in a way that matters. But then also when we talk about this work of next gen and BIPOC, how is our board reflecting that voice, that presence? How are we centering them? We did some significant work at the beginning of this year, codifying in our bylaws this intention around equity, but then also carving out seats on our board for these particular next gen honorees to have an opportunity to join and share the expertise that they currently have, align with seasoned or more seasoned professional leaders in the field. And then as we were carving out these seats on our board, it was also important for us to wrap around professional development in that intention. So where we lie in the field in terms of our focus on workforce and our focus on development, we wanted to ensure that that also bore out in our practice as a board and how we're constructed. I see NAA's role as an intermediary, as a connector, a convener, a resource broker. And I think that where we have opportunity is to continue to be an echo chamber for best practices that are happening in the field, but also the very intentional things that we're doing internally that can serve as a model to others as to very practical ways that we can center BIPOC and next generation leaders.
That's great. Thanks for that, Tommy. You actually even spoke to a question I jotted down as a follow-up for you, so which was around this like internal, and when we think about individual transformation, positioning, changing power and how we do run our organizations, there's also organizational, and then there's these internal like systems changes for philanthropy, as well as national intermediaries like NAA to look at. And that's one of the things I find very hopeful about this time, is more and more organizations and foundations, folks across all levels, from direct service intermediaries, foundations, are all saying, what are we doing internally and how we walk the talk? And that's what's going to make this sticky, right? And doing this work and create deeper transformation. So thanks for that. So I've looked at the questions here. There's a couple that I want to bring forward that kind of hone into like this role of philanthropy, right? We've heard a bit about the programs, and everyone should be very much intrigued about learning more about them now, having heard from everyone from participants to the designers of the funders of the programs. So want to ask a question. So there's some questions about the foundation. So I'm curious, are you all finding that funders are seeing the potential of out of school time to address the larger gap in leadership across the country? So when we think about locally or across the country, right? Out of school time is largely made up of leaders of color at the line staff, reflective of children and youth or low income communities as well, right? And so there's such an opportunity to really tap into out of school time as an avenue for addressing even when we think about the teacher workforce and pipeline even into teaching. So Are you finding that philanthropy is seeing out of school time as an opportunity to not only diversify leadership in out of school time, but the broader workforce? Danielle, you want to jump in there?
I guess I'll go. I think, when we hear about this great resignation that's occurring, there's a lot of talent leaving the sector for so many reasons. And I think that it is making the conversation, it's timely. People are having the conversation. I know we're having conversations with our grantees around raising salaries for line staff because talent is leaving. So we need a way to keep some of the talent in there. And the salaries have been historically low. And we as private philanthropy have that flexibility in our funding to do that. So that's something that we're really looking closely at and really pushing our grant dollars towards. So that's.
I just want to jump into Kathleen's question because it's come up in our group as well.
Yeah.
So one of the things we're doing with our space is offering opportunities to bring in other funders to come in and talk on particular topics our leaders have expressed interest in understanding. And these kinds of questions are coming up in those sessions with grant makers, right? So what is your foundation doing to close the resourcing gap between organizations that are BIPOC led versus not? And so, and we prep the people coming in to speak in our spaces before they show up. So it's not like a gotcha kind of session, but it's really about inviting funders in who want to have these conversations, who also, this just happened in one of our sessions, who also want to ask the leaders for their perspectives on what more they could or should be doing. So what it's doing for us is creating an opportunity for the leaders to give feedback directly to grant makers in a sort of protected way where the power dynamic is not quite what it normally is. And it's also allowing the grant makers to come in and really just have a chance to talk about how they want to make journey on this work, places where they may be stuck and looking for useful insight. So we're finding that it's a good way. It's also putting our leaders' organizations on the radar of these funders, which they may not have been before, in a way that isn't as exhausting for the poor leaders to have to do for themselves. So just want to add that as well.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you, Erika. Yeah.
I'll speak to like the funding piece. So I think if we look at what our corporate partners, how they invest in leadership development, identify leaders at a young age, give them opportunities. We're nowhere close, right? We look at what the military does in terms at how they identify young leaders and advance them, not comparable, nor comparable to our partners in formal education space that have identified principals as key levers in performance. So I think while we have made some advancements, and I think foundations like Pinkerton are doing a great job setting that. I mean, I think also funding that we receive from the Bechtel Foundation to focus on some leadership development are very promising practices. But I think if we look at, and I do worry a little bit now because there is so much focus in our field right now on what we call frontline staffing, the huge turnover and trying to accommodate staffing models to support the children who need services, that we are going to, we don't have a good track record of being able to do more than one crisis at a time necessarily, but I don't want us to lose focus on these leadership interventions because I think those are very important, leadership at all levels. I think an important point that Angelica was sharing that we run into a lot is that sometimes, we get very caught up in leadership only being attached to titles. And I think what she shared was, she had a really hard time thinking about herself as a leader. But if we don't do investments at every level of the leadership journey, we're not going to be successful in the way that we need to be. And I think the other piece I would add, I think thinking about boards of nonprofits and boards of youth serving agencies and all as the leadership pool that needs intervention is another discussion that we probably need to have as well.
Yeah, that could be a whole session on its own, definitely. Maybe, yeah, it's great. There's a follow-up question to the conversation that's happening now, which is asked earlier around any knowledge of other funders that are funding similar programs. And I know Tipping Point is definitely one of those funders doing that. And I've heard of some others. Danielle, others, any reflections around that, around is philanthropy starting to make investments like the one that you're doing and how you're approaching it? Which is very much a power sharing approach.
Yeah, I'm gonna toss it to Erika Hamilton, who knows about that. I mean, I know there are a number of organizations that in New York City, but there, again, we saw a void. But those programs were more focused on emerging leaders. But Erika's the most versed in this, so Erika Hamilton.
I'll keep it really brief. I think that in addition to working with the Pinkerton Foundation, I also work with a few other foundations on this topic. And what I'm seeing is definitely in this moment we're in, a desire to sort of move forward, but oftentimes a bit of paralysis in knowing what to do next. And then also realizing that you're going to have to sort of sequence the work. You can't try to address all of the trauma around driving racial equity at once. And so what I'm seeing increasingly is a lot of interest in working in collaboration in the grant making space. So grant makers wanting to come in and be in thought partnership with other grant makers who are already doing the work or others who are interested in exploring the topic. And so part of what we are talking about is the Pinkerton Advanced Leadership Network program was started as a 2-year initiative. We're almost midpoint to that. And so one of the things we're trying to think about is what is the next step become? Is it still Pinkerton doing it on its own? Could it be seeing if there are other funders who might be interested in collaborating? And not just here in New York, but beyond that as well geographically. So those are some conversations we're having as well.
Okay. I want to try to squeeze in, because I see an echoing of this question that was popped into the chat, which I think also relates, is what do folks think the role of foundations can be in influencing the government funders? So knowing these out-of-school time programs, there's a lot of funding that's coming from the government. Many of them are made possible because of that. That's how we're reaching low-income communities and communities of color. So what's the role of philanthropy of helping these organizations influence government to put the money that's needed to address some of these issues that were named earlier around pay and leadership development, kind of pathways and whatnot? Any reflections there?
Well,
maybe that's an area. Okay, go ahead, Gina.
Well, I'll just share what we hear. So I'm coming off a 2-day board retreat with so we had a lot of these discussions. I think you're going to see reluctance on the part of government to fund those kind of initiatives. Governments are very focused on funding access to programs. That's generally the parameters around the funding that they provide. So I think it presents a wonderful opportunity for foundations to come in and supplement funds that maybe are directed at young people with funds that are directed at leaders to really, make sure, we know the crucial role that the adults play in these programs. Sometimes that's not always reflected in our public funding allocation. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity for collaboration support among private and public funders.
Great, thanks. That may be another great topic. So we have a couple minutes here. I actually would like to open it up to Erika Halstead and Angelica to see if you have any takeaways for our funders here and what more philanthropy can do to be supporting leaders of color and really transforming our leadership face, practice, culture, etc.
Thinking about the after school workforce, and part of our conversations like we had our board retreat this week, it's really is how is philanthropy, one, my first question or thought is, are the school districts and philanthropy talking about how philanthropy is supporting after school and how districts are using their money to support after school? Because we know that these wages need to increase. Like Gina always talks about the cost of quality. We want this investment that we've seen in education to be well thought out and worth it. And I think that these two agencies are going to have to talk to each other to ensure that we are really putting money where it matters, and that's in the after school staff. So I'd be curious what the conversation is between all of those.
Great. Thanks, Angelica. Erika.
Yeah, the only thing, I dropped a comment in the chat about the fact that most EDs I know of color are one-time EDs. They serve in that role and then they leave. They don't have enough access. And one of the things they don't have enough access to is, in fact, philanthropy. When you look at the boards of organizations led by people of color, they tend to be much more diverse. They also tend to be much earlier in their career. Meaning, if you are a foundation that is not application based, if it's, you need to know somebody on your board, a board member who is mid-career Black accountant is probably not going to have that connection, right? They're not in that C-suite chair. And so what I would encourage, my friends here and of course in your communities to do is really look at who you're funding and how they're coming to your organization. And if you're not seeing enough leaders of color, right, then I would encourage you to figure out why, right? I think that is the number one thing I see is that my friends who are white leaders have lots of family foundations, getting funding from lots of family foundations that I have no access to. And that means that those dollars are left on the table. Those dollars are only going to some kinds of organizations. So
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, my email's in the chat if anybody else has follow-up questions.
Thanks. I know it's such a rich conversation. Kathleen, are we at time?
We are, and I do want to say thank you so much to all of you for being in this conversation. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for really teaching everybody here today for a solid hour, which is only not even scratching the surface. Super appreciate it. And I hope you will continue to be in conversation with us. I think a lot of things were raised that Rebecca and I really want to dig into. Thank you everybody for joining us. And as Rebecca put in the chat, join us again next month, December 17th. So we're always the third Friday. All of our speakers are also invited to join us every third Friday for these conversations. And we really, really look forward to continuing to talk with you, and best of luck for all of your work. Take care, everybody.